When 39-year-old single mom Laura Carter opened the battered envelope from her ex-husband's lawyer, she burst out laughing. Inside was nothing but a yellowing receipt for an abandoned storage warehouse. What she didn't know was that behind its rusted doors waited an art collection worth over $30 million, and a storm of danger powerful enough to shatter her life all over again. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind. Laura Carter thought her divorce settlement couldn't get any worse. Sitting at the long mahogany table across from Charles and his legal team, she'd felt every bit of the 12 years she had given him collapse into dust. The polished conference room smelled faintly of coffee and cologne, but underneath the surface it reeked of betrayal. She had walked into the marriage a wide-eyed 20-something with dreams of building a family and a life together, and she walked out of it now with nothing more than custody arrangements, a modest child support check, and a heart hollowed out by humiliation. Charles barely glanced at her as the papers were signed, his new fiancée waiting in the lobby, a woman 10 years younger with teeth too white and laughter that sliced like glass. Laura wondered if this woman knew who she was marrying. Probably not. Probably never would. The lawyer slid a battered cardboard box across the table toward her with the indifference of someone passing along an unwanted package. "This is the remainder of your marital property," he said, avoiding her eyes. Laura peered inside, half expecting to find more of Charles's arrogance tucked between the envelopes and receipts. Old insurance forms, crumpled bills, a tarnished cufflink, and near the bottom, folded and yellowing with age, a warehouse storage receipt stamped with a fading logo. She snorted in disbelief. This was it? After 12 years, countless nights waiting for him to come home from business dinners, this was her consolation prize. Junk mail and a useless slip of paper. Charles smirked when he saw it, the corner of his mouth twisting into that familiar look that once charmed her but now only reminded her of every lie. "Probably a bunch of broken furniture in there," he muttered. "You can have it." He stood up before she could reply, already checking his phone, as if the past decade of their life had been nothing more than a meeting he was late for. His cologne lingered long after he left, a reminder that he had walked away from everything without a backward glance. Her lawyer offered her a sympathetic smile, the kind that said he'd seen this too many times before. "You don't have to bother with the warehouse," he advised. "It's probably worthless. Some receipts don't even match real units anymore." Laura tucked it into her purse anyway, not because she believed it held any value, but because it was hers. In the debris of what her marriage had become, she clung to anything she could call her own. That evening, back in her cramped, two-bedroom apartment with its flickering kitchen light and the faint smell of the neighbor's curry drifting through the vents, Laura sorted through the box again. Her 11-year-old son Daniel sat at the table working on his math homework, chewing the end of his pencil, unaware that his mother's world was spinning off its axis. She smiled at him when he looked up, forcing a steadiness she didn't feel. She couldn't let him see the despair curling around her ribs. She'd promised herself that whatever she had to sacrifice, Daniel would never feel unwanted. She held the warehouse receipt up to the light, studying its faded ink. A laugh bubbled out of her throat, dry and bitter. "Well, Daniel," she said softly, "maybe we've inherited a pile of broken chairs." He didn't answer, lost in the puzzle of long division, but she kept staring at the paper. Something about it unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. It felt like the punchline to a cruel joke, a symbol of everything Charles thought of her, forgettable, disposable, worth nothing. She tucked it into the drawer by her bed, telling herself she'd check the place out over the weekend. Not because she expected anything, but because she needed to close that door, both literally and metaphorically. That night, folding laundry under the yellow glow of her bedside lamp, Laura thought of the woman Charles had replaced her with. She wondered if, in 5 years, that woman would be sitting where she was now, nursing wounds invisible to the eye. She shook the thought away and focused on the mundane rhythm of pairing socks, smoothing shirts. The warehouse key rattled inside her drawer, a tiny reminder that some chapters refuse to end neatly, no matter how hard you try. She whispered a silent promise to herself as she drifted into sleep. She would go, she would see, and she would never again let Charles dictate the measure of her worth. The warehouse sat on the edge of town like a forgotten monument to decay. Corrugated steel walls streaked with rust rose out of the cracked asphalt lot, graffiti curling across the surface like scars that no one cared enough to cover. Laura's Honda Civic sputtered into the lot, its engine whining as if reluctant to stop in a place that felt so deserted. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, earbuds dangling around his neck, eyes wide as he took in the bleak scene. "This looks like a horror movie, Mom," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand and forced a laugh. "Then let's hope the ending is better than the beginning." Inside the office, the manager barely looked up from his newspaper when she handed him the receipt. He glanced at it, shrugged, and pulled a massive ring of keys from a hook on the wall. "Unit 47, he grunted. His boots echoed as he led them through aisles of silent metal doors, each one padlocked, each one hiding stories long abandoned. Dust floated in the air, catching shafts of pale light that streamed through the grimy skylights. When he unlocked the unit and slid the door upward, the sound grated against Laura's nerves like metal screaming. The smell hit first. Old wood, varnish turned brittle, and the faint musk of canvas aged by decades. Laura lifted her phone, the flashlight beam cutting across the darkness. She expected to see sagging couches or boxes of moldy books. Instead, towers of wooden crates stood like sentinels, stacked 3 high, some taller than Daniel. Each was stenciled in black lettering, shipping marks, numbers, the names of cities she barely recognized. Paris, Geneva, Berlin. Her breath caught. At first, she thought they were theatrical props, leftovers from one of Charles' half-baked ventures. He had always chased eccentric investments, from a failed wine import business to a doomed attempt at luxury candles. But then her light caught the edge of a crate, where the stencil read something unmistakable: Christie's. On another, Sotheby's. The names tugged at her memory, luxury auction houses she'd glimpsed in glossy magazines while waiting at salon appointments years ago, back when her life had been comfortable, back when she thought wealth and love were permanent. Her heart thudded painfully. She reached out, fingers trembling as she brushed away dust from a crate label. Daniel leaned closer, whispering, "Mom, what is this stuff?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know," she whispered back, though the pit of her stomach told her the truth was bigger than anything she'd imagined. She set her phone on a crate, balancing its light as she pried at the lid of the nearest box. The wood groaned, nails reluctant to release secrets buried for who knew how long. When the top finally gave, she peeled back layers of yellowed paper to reveal a canvas that seemed to breathe color into the dusty air. Swirls of blue and green, strokes alive with energy, signed in a corner with a name she had seen only in textbooks: Chagall. Laura stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The laughter that had bubbled from her days ago in the lawyer's office was gone, replaced by a silence heavy with awe and dread. Daniel's small hand clutched her sleeve. "Is it real?" he asked. She had no answer, only the dawning realization that Charles had hidden something beyond comprehension. Her gaze swept the other crates, each one a potential vault of unimaginable worth. The warehouse felt suddenly alive, humming with secrets that had waited years to be uncovered. Her knees weakened, the air thick with the knowledge that this wasn't furniture, this wasn't junk, this was fortune or danger, sealed in wood and canvas. Her phone buzzed on the crate, startling her. Rachel's name flashed across the screen, her friend's voice urgent when Laura answered. "You opened it, didn't you? Laura, listen to me. Do not touch anything else. Do not tell anyone else. You have no idea what you've just walked into." Laura's laughter had died the moment she saw the signatures on those crates, but now it was buried completely. The faded receipt was no longer a cruel joke. It was a key that had unlocked a storm she wasn't ready for. Curiosity overwhelmed fear. Laura's hands trembled as she wedged the edge of a crowbar under the crate lid, wood splintering against her knuckles. The sound seemed to echo through the cavernous warehouse, a crack of thunder in a place that had been silent for years. Splinters caught the soft skin of her fingers, but she barely felt the sting. She pulled, pried, and finally the top gave with a groan, revealing layers of protective paper yellowed at the edges. Daniel stood close behind her, the beam from his small flashlight bouncing against the walls like a nervous pulse. He sucked in a sharp breath when Laura peeled back the first layer, the paper disintegrating in places like the brittle skin of an old book. Beneath, a riot of blues and greens exploded into the stale air, as if color itself had been trapped inside the crate, waiting for release. Laura had never been an art connoisseur. Her knowledge came from brief museum field trips in high school and glossy magazines flipped through in waiting rooms. But even she knew the name scrawled in the corner, bold and unmistakable: Chagall. The letters swam in her vision, and for a moment she felt as if the floor had shifted under her. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over Daniel's sneakers. His voice was a whisper, thin and fragile in the vast room. "Mom, is it real?" Her throat tightened. The word real carried more weight than she was ready to bear. Real meant value beyond imagination. Millions, perhaps. Real meant her ex-husband hadn't just stashed old furniture in a forgotten warehouse, he had hidden a fortune. Real meant danger, the kind of danger that didn't stay neatly locked inside wooden crates. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling the hammer of her heart. Her first instinct was denial. It couldn't be real. Not here, not in this forgotten place. But her second instinct, just as quick, was to document. She pulled out her phone, the glow of the screen, a comfort in the dimness. She snapped photo after photo, angles of the signature, the brushstrokes, the crate label. Her fingers moved before her mind caught up, sending them to Rachel, the only person she trusted enough to understand the magnitude of what she was looking at. Rachel's reply came almost instantly, the three dots dancing before the words appeared. "Laura, don't touch anything. This could be worth millions. Call me right now." The certainty in those words made her stomach drop. She looked at Daniel, who was staring wide-eyed at the painting, his lips parted in awe. He didn't understand the weight pressing down on her chest, but he could sense it. He always could. She gathered him close, whispering, "We're leaving. Now." She pulled the crate lid closed as best she could, her hands shaking. But she couldn't erase the image burned into her memory, the explosion of color, the signature, the undeniable truth. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the warehouse door groaning shut behind them, Laura felt the air shift. It was as if the world had been split into two parts, the life she had before opening that crate, and the life she had now, standing on the precipice of a discovery too large, too dangerous, to carry alone. Rachel arrived within hours, her tires screeching against the gravel lot as she pulled up in her old sedan. Laura watched her friend climb out, hair pulled back hastily, face pale, eyes sharp with a kind of urgency Laura had never seen before. She had known Rachel since college, the steady friend who wore sensible shoes and carried tote bags filled with academic journals. But the woman walking toward her now looked like she was stepping into a battlefield. Inside the warehouse, Rachel moved quickly, her fingers grazing the edges of the crates as if they were sacred relics. She muttered under her breath, words Laura barely recognized, names of painters, movements, schools of art. She stopped at one crate, her hands shaking as she tore away a corner of wrapping to reveal bold geometric shapes. Her voice was hushed, reverent. Picasso. She moved to another, eyes widening at a deep field of red, the brushstrokes heavy and deliberate. Rothko. Another. Matisse. Laura stood frozen, the enormity of it all pressing in. Each name Rachel whispered was like a stone dropped into her stomach, heavy, pulling her deeper into waters she couldn't navigate. She remembered Charles bragging about business trips to Europe, the way he'd wave off her questions with a careless smile. She thought of the nights he came home late, smelling faintly of expensive whiskey and smoke, his phone face down on the nightstand, messages buzzing that he never explained. Rachel turned to her, eyes wide, face drained of color. "Laura, these aren't just paintings. This is a collection, a serious one." Her voice shook. "And no one just forgets about a collection like this." Laura's mouth went dry. "What are you saying? That Charles, what, bought these?" Rachel shook her head. "No, not like this. A collection like this doesn't belong to one man, not unless he's a billionaire. And Charles, Charles wasn't, Laura snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. But Rachel was already gripping her arm, her nails pressing into her skin. If this is real, people will come for it. Dangerous people. You need to be careful. Laura swallowed hard, the memory of Charles' charm flashing through her mind. His reckless ventures, his whispers about offshore accounts, the way he always seemed to have cash when they needed it, even when his businesses were failing on paper. She thought of the storage receipt tossed to her like garbage, the casual way he dismissed it. Was it arrogance? A mistake? Or had he known all along that eventually someone would open the wrong crate? The air in the warehouse felt heavier now, charged with secrets. Daniel shuffled closer, sensing the tension, his voice small. "Mom, what's going to happen?" Laura knelt down, brushing his hair back, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Nothing. Nothing is going to happen to us." But even as she said it, the words felt hollow. The paintings loomed in their crates, silent and damning, each one a loaded weapon pointed at her life. Rachel exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady herself. "Listen to me. Do not tell anyone. Not the police, not your lawyer. No one. Until we know exactly what this is, you're sitting on a powder keg. One wrong move and—" She broke off, glancing at Daniel, her words swallowed by the unspoken. Laura's chest tightened. She had thought the worst part of the divorce was behind her. She had thought the battles were over, that she could rebuild quietly, piece by piece. But now she understood. She hadn't walked away from Charles' world. She had inherited it. And it was darker, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. 2 days after the warehouse, rain came hard and cold, chiseling the city into gray slabs and forcing people under awnings and umbrellas. Laura was at the sink, rinsing the coffee pot, when the buzzer for her downstairs entry shattered the small routine she'd managed to build for herself. She hesitated, fingers damp on the metal, the receipt folded into the back pocket of her jeans like a secret she couldn't quite hide. Daniel was upstairs doing homework, the little apartment quiet, except for the television's muted morning show. When she opened the door, Charles was standing there so clean, so composed, his expensive coat dripping onto the mat in a way that made her chest tighten with an old, private knowledge of how he'd always entered rooms like a promise of trouble. He didn't look surprised to see her at home. He didn't ask about Daniel. He didn't smile like he used to when he wanted forgiveness. The man on her threshold wore the same arrogance Laura had once married. It hadn't softened with age. Instead, it had become something more dangerous, a practiced cruelty that had learned to hide in tailored suits and bank accounts. "You've been to the warehouse," he said without preamble. His voice was a blade clean, certain. A cold thread of fear wound through Laura. How did he know? She hadn't told anyone except Rachel, had kept the receipt buried between pages of a cookbook on her return. Her lawyer had been useful in procedural ways, but she'd never expected Charles to have eyes like a hawk. Her mouth went dry. "How do you—" she began, then stopped. The answer was obvious and ugly. He had underestimated her for the last time. Charles's smirk widened, the expression she hated because of how small it made her feel and how much it revealed about him. "You don't know what you're holding," he said, the words measured, deliberate. "That collection doesn't belong to you. It never did." His jaw worked as if he was chewing something distasteful. "You should have left it alone." For a beat she thought he might be bluffing, that the rage in his chest at being outplayed would dissolve into the usual manipulative charm. But there was none of his old pleading, no attempt to wrap his threat in the language of loss or regret. He was cold and clinical. "Stay out of it, Laura. You don't want to know the people who will ask questions. You don't want what they're capable of." The apartment seemed to tilt, the walls thin, familiar, the place she'd built with the small, stubborn comforts of thrift store dishes and Daniel's drawings taped to the refrigerator, felt suddenly exposed. "Are you threatening me?" The words were small but steady, a line carved against the tremor in her voice. Charles stepped closer, and for a second she saw the man who'd once kissed her on a roof in Paris, or at least he'd said he'd taken her to Paris, and the memory tasted like ash. "I'm telling you to be smart," he said softly. "You're good at being small, Laura. You always have been. Don't try to be anything else. Let it go, sell it, walk away. You don't have to be brave." He looked like a man offering a bargain, like the negotiator he'd always pretended to be. She thought of Rachel's warning, of the way her friend had gripped her arm like a lifeline in that cold warehouse, the way the professor had muttered the names of galleries like incantations. She thought of the lawyer's pale face, the bead of sweat on his temple, about the way people who handled the ugly corners of the world tended to look like they were about to vomit. "I can't," she said finally, the word heavier than she expected. "I won't be blackmailed into throwing away something that's mine." Charles's eyes hardened. For a second, he looked almost human, raw, real, but the look passed like a shadow. "You think it's yours?" he sneered. "You can't even manage your own bank account. You'd lose that painting at a yard sale and never know what you lost. You don't understand the law, the money, the people involved?" Charles lowered his voice until it was barely audible. He's been careful, very careful. But when things get messy, when governments get involved, it's not like losing a purse, Laura. People disappear. This isn't about money. It's about leverage. And don't think for a second you're safe, or you're Sun Island. A raw panic rose in her chest so fast it blurred her vision. This was never about the trappings of their failed marriage. It had always been about what he'd hidden beneath the shiny surfaces. The man who'd left her a cardboard box and a text message about moving on had apparently kept secrets like bank vaults. "If you think you can scare me into handing it over, you are wrong," she said. She surprised herself with the steadiness. The years of small indignities had built a backbone of something fierce. She pictured Daniel's face when he slept, the way he laughed at cartoons, simple things she would not surrender. Charles's jaw tightened like the closing of a trap. He turned towards the hall as if to leave, then paused. "You could make this easy," he said. "Sell it quietly. Let me handle the aftermath. If you don't, people will start asking questions. And Laura? They don't care about custody hearings. They don't give a damn about excuses." He took a step toward the door, and just before he left, hissed, "Stay out of this." When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt too small to hold her. It felt like an evidence room. Every little thing that had bound her life, laundry, dishes, the cheap couch, suddenly looked like a backdrop for a story she had not decided to star in. She ran a hand over her face, as if trying to smooth out the shock. The receipt in her pocket seemed heavier than paper. For the first time since the divorce, she was afraid not of poverty or embarrassment, but of a deeper darkness she'd only glimpsed at the edges of Charles's life. 2 nights later, after sleepless hours and whispered conversations with Rachel, and a careful, terrified call to the one lawyer she trusted now, she walked into his office with the receipt clutched in her fist. The building smelled of cheap cologne and coffee gone stale, and the fluorescent lights hummed with bureaucratic indifference. She found the lawyer at his polished desk, an older man with a receding hairline who had once made her feel safe by explaining the legalities of the divorce in slow, patient sentences. When she said the word art, he paled. The confident mask dropped like a curtain, revealing not shock, but a carefully concealed dread. "You said you'd never mentioned that unit," she accused, the sound harsher than she intended. "Charles told me it was worthless furniture, trash. You were complicit in that lie." His fingers trembled over his mug. He swallowed and tried to fashion a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I did what I was told," he said, voice brittle. "Charles instructed me explicitly never to bring up that storage unit in negotiations. Said it would complicate things." Sweat beaded at his temple. "He told me to call it junk. Said I was protecting him." Laura felt anger coil like a snake in her gut. Hot and dangerous. "You protected him. You lied to me. To a woman who trusted you to guard her legal rights. Why?" The lawyer's shoulders drooped under the weight of whatever truth he'd been carrying. "It's not as simple as lying to keep money away from you," he said finally, the words coming out like reluctant confessions. "Years ago, Charles bought lots of art from auctions in Eastern Europe. He used advisors, intermediaries, offshore firms. Some of the works were legitimate sales. Other pieces may have been missing from museums, moved during conflicts, or sold in gray markets." Laura's stomach flipped. The legal term felt sterile, gray markets. But beneath it was uglier. Stolen art, black market deals, and people willing to cross borders and laws. You're saying he stole them? She asked, the breath in her throat. He shook his head like someone trying to dislodge an unpleasant fly. I'm saying some pieces have questionable provenance. They may have been moved during wartime, when records were scrambled. Others may have been bought through intermediaries who didn't ask all the right questions. Charles didn't ask either. He wanted masterpieces at a price he thought no one would find. If the authorities start to look closely, this isn't just tax evasion. This could be repatriation claims, criminal charges, investigations that drag in governments. It could mean seizure. It could mean investigations that get very public and very ugly. The word radioactive came almost as a whisper from his lips, and it lodged itself in her mind like an accusation. Radioactive? Legally and politically, he said. If these are art pieces with contested ownership, say, removed from countries during war or sold by people who didn't have rights to them, governments will ask for them back. Museums will start asking questions. Private collectors will make claims. And where there's money, millions of people will get violent. There are smugglers who don't like to talk, lawyers who do very dirty work, and collectors who will stop at nothing. Her hands closed into a fist around the receipt. So what do I do? Her voice was small, urgent. Get rid of it? Sell it quietly? You said so yourself. At the meeting Charles told you to hide it. If I walk away, and he's being investigated, will they come after me? The lawyer's expression softened with a sliver of something she hadn't expected, pity. Laura, you can't make these problems go away by pretending they're not there, he said. If authorities find something and you've sold it, you could be accused of aiding in the concealment of stolen property, even unknowingly. If criminal elements find out, you could be threatened or worse. The safest route is to get professionals involved. Provenance experts, the right art lawyers, and discreet channels to document everything. But you must be careful who you trust. Charles had people who will move fast to secure assets if they sense a threat. Her world narrowed to a pointed, urgent beam. The crates, the Chego, the men who might come knocking. She had never imagined a life that involved provenance reports and diplomatic claims. She had been a teacher, a mom, a woman who knew the cadence of school drop-offs and PTA meetings. Now she had to become someone else, someone who could navigate the soft, dangerous underside of the art world where money, history, and crime braided into one. The lawyer leaned forward, voice a conspiratorial whisper. Get rid of it, Laura, he repeated, but his eyes begged for another path. No, don't do anything alone. Let us find secure, trusted people. But act quickly. If the wrong people find out you've opened his crate, he won't be the only one coming for answers. He met her eyes with a look that made clear he'd seen the aftermath of similar storms and didn't trust the faint-hearted to survive them. Outside, rain drummed its mortar on the city windows, a steady punctuation to a day that had dissolved the small certainties of Laura's life. She left the office with her receipt burning in her pocket and a new, brittle resolve in her chest. Whatever Charles had been hiding, whatever misdeeds shadowed those canvases, she would face it on her terms. For Daniel. For the quiet years of laundry and homework and scraped knees that deserved something other than fear. She would call Rachel, she thought, and then Elena, and then the one reputable art conservator Rachel had mentioned. She would build a ring of light around her son and herself and somehow find a way through. But the list of people who would want those paintings, lawyers, museums, governments, criminals, already began to crowd the edges of her life like vultures circling the scent of blood. That night, Laura sat at the small kitchen table, her hands curled around a mug she had no intention of drinking. The apartment was dim, except for the soft glow from the lamp, the kind of glow that used to feel like safety after a long day. But the safety was gone. Her phone buzzed against the table, a vibration that felt like a jolt of electricity through her spine. An unknown number. She hesitated, pulse drumming in her ears, before finally swiping the screen. The message was short. Brutal. We know what you found. Meet us at the warehouse tomorrow. Or else. Her breath caught. She read the words aloud, the syllables brittle and sharp in the air. Daniel looked up from the couch, his homework forgotten, his young face pale in the lamplight. Mom, What does that mean?" His voice trembled. She didn't answer right away because she couldn't, because answering meant acknowledging that everything she had tried to keep at bay, the fear, the danger, was now breaking into their lives like a flood. Daniel pressed closer, his small hands gripping her arm. "Go to the police," he begged, his voice cracking. "Tell them, they'll protect us." His eyes were wide, desperate, still clinging to the belief that adults with badges could put walls between them and the shadows. But Laura's stomach twisted. She imagined walking into a precinct, explaining that her ex-husband had hidden millions of dollars worth of stolen or smuggled art in a warehouse. She imagined the skeptical stares, the polite nods that would eventually turn into questions she couldn't answer. Was the art hers? Was it stolen? Did she know about the transactions? She pictured Daniel watching her be treated like a suspect, not a victim. She shook her head, the words catching in her throat. "It's not that simple." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the sound of the refrigerator's hum and the faint patter of rain against the window. Laura forced herself to move, to lock the door, to double-check the chain, as if flimsy metal could shield them from whatever sent that message. She tucked Daniel into bed, his small body curling under the covers, his eyes still searching hers for answers she didn't have. "We're okay," she whispered, smoothing his hair. "I won't let anything happen to you." But even as the words left her mouth, they tasted like lies. Hours later, sleep eluded her. The weight of the message pressed on her chest, each second dragging with the heaviness of dread. At 3 a.m., her eyes snapped open at the sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. In the hallway outside their door, she froze. Breath caught in her throat. Shadows flickered under the crack, moving like predators circling prey. Her heart slammed against her ribs as the doorknob rattled softly, just once, as though testing. She crept to Daniel's room, her pulse deafening in her ears. He stirred when she shook his shoulder, blinking up at her groggily. "Mom?" She pressed a finger to her lips, her whisper barely audible. "We're not safe here anymore." The truth she had buried beneath denial finally broke free. She gathered him in her arms, holding him so tightly he winced, and listened as the footsteps retreated into silence. But silence was no comfort. It only confirmed what she already knew. The danger had found them. By dawn, Laura was a blur of motion, her body running on fear instead of sleep. She pulled a duffel bag from the closet, shoving in clothes without thought for matching or weather. She packed Daniel's inhaler, his homework folder, the photos she had taken of the paintings, each image both proof and curse. The essentials of their life reduced to what she could carry on her shoulder. Daniel moved wordlessly beside her, his fear sharpening into obedience. He fetched his toothbrush, his sneakers, clutching the worn stuffed bear he'd had since kindergarten. She didn't tell him to leave it. She couldn't take one more piece of his comfort away. The Honda Civic coughed awake as if reluctant to face the road ahead. Its dented body and squealing brakes had once embarrassed her, but now the car was freedom. It was escape. She drove with white-knuckled hands, every glance in the rearview mirror, a prayer that they weren't being followed. The city gave way to highways, then to stretches of rural roads that felt no safer. Every gas station was a trial. She scanned the pumps, the parked trucks, the men smoking near the entrance. Every glance lingered too long. Every movement felt loaded with menace. She hurried Daniel to the restroom, her eyes darting, her pulse never slowing. Every parked car became surveillance, every face a spy. The paranoia ate at her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just paranoia. That SUV parked 2 rows behind them at the diner, the same one later at the motel. Black, tinted windows. Always still, always waiting. Rachel's voice through the phone was urgent, steady, cutting through the static of fear. "You can't keep running blind, Laura. You need help, real help." Laura wanted to argue, wanted to cling to the illusion that she could protect Daniel by keeping their world small and secret. But Rachel's next words cut her resistance. "I know someone. A man named Mark Delgado, retired FBI. He's helped people before. He knows what this looks like. The name lodged in Laura's mind, heavy with possibility. Retired FBI. Someone who might believe her, someone who might see the danger without treating her like a criminal. But exposing Daniel to another stranger felt unbearable. She bit her lip, eyes on the dark smear of the road stretching endlessly ahead. "I can't trust anyone right now," she whispered. "Laura," Rachel's voice softened. "You have no choice. If you keep driving like this, the wrong people will find you first. At least let Mark meet you. At least hear him out." Laura didn't respond. She ended the call, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat as if distance could quiet the pounding in her head. Hours passed in a haze of asphalt and fear, Daniel dozing fitfully against the window. Dusk bled across the sky when she pulled into another motel, her nerves frayed, her body aching from tension. She stepped out of the car, and that's when she saw it. The SUV. Parked at the edge of the lot, engine off, but too familiar to dismiss. Her chest tightened, breath hitching. She yanked Daniel from the car, her voice sharper than she intended. "Inside. Now." His eyes widened, but he obeyed. Inside the room, she double-locked the door, shoved the dresser against it, and finally let the fear break through the dam. Her hands shook as she pulled her phone back into her palm, dialing with frantic urgency. Rachel answered on the first ring. "Call him," Laura said, her voice cracking. "Call your friend, Mark Delgado. Whoever he island, we can't do this alone." The words tasted like surrender, but also like survival. And as Daniel clutched her hand, his small fingers threading through hers, Laura understood that survival was all that mattered now. The diner set off a lonely stretch of highway, the kind of place where truckers came for black coffee and pie thick with sugar, where the smell of grease and bacon clung to every corner. Laura slid into the booth opposite the man Rachel had told her to meet, her palms slick with sweat despite the chill from the humming air conditioner above. Mark Delgado was larger than she had expected, broad-shouldered, with a jaw set like stone and eyes that seemed to dissect every detail around him, the waitress's nervous glance, the truck idling too long outside, the tremor in Laura's hand as she reached for the laminated menu. He didn't waste time. "Show me what you've got," he said, his voice rough, gravel-edged. Laura fumbled with her bag, pulling out the phone where she had stored the photos. Her thumb hovered over the screen, a part of her hesitating even now, afraid of what showing him meant. But Daniel's hand pressed lightly against her arm, steadying her, so she swiped open the gallery and slid the device across the table. Mark leaned in, the glow from the screen reflecting off his weathered face. He scrolled slowly, his expression unreadable, until he finally let out a long, low whistle. "Lady," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've stumbled onto the art world's Bermuda Triangle." The words made Laura's stomach twist. "What do you mean?" He tapped the screen where the Chagall shimmered in digital form. "Pieces like this don't just disappear. They vanish lost in wars, stolen from museums, hidden in vaults. And sometimes they resurface, decades later, in hands they don't belong. If your ex was sitting on a collection like this..." He trailed off, his gaze cutting into hers. "Then he was tangled with people who don't forgive, people who don't forget." Laura pulled the phone back, her throat dry. "So what happens now? Do I take it to the police? The FBI? Do I tell them everything?" Mark's eyes hardened. He leaned back in the booth, arms crossing his chest as though settling into a lecture he had given many times before. "You've got two choices," he said. "Turn it over to the feds and risk losing everything. The art gets seized, stuck in evidence lockers, handed off to countries and institutions that will fight for years over who it belongs to. You'll be left with nothing but questions. Or..." He paused, lowering his voice, until Laura had to lean in to hear him. "You play it smart. You use it as leverage. You stay alive long enough to figure out what Charles was really mixed up in, and maybe, just maybe, you walk away with your life intact." Daniel stirred beside her, his young face pale. "Alive?" he echoed softly, the word trembling in the air like fragile glass. Mark glanced at him, then back at Laura. "This isn't about paintings anymore. It's about survival. People don't chase art for beauty, not in this world. They chase it for what it can buy them. And that kind of hunger?" He shook his head. It doesn't stop. The waitress appeared with coffee and pie, her smile strained. Laura wrapped her hands around the chipped mug, the steam fogging her glasses. Mark's words rattled in her chest. She had spent so long fighting to hold her life together after Charles left, scraping for every bill, every ounce of stability. Now she was being told that survival wasn't about money at all. It was about staying one step ahead of the people who wanted her silenced. She looked at Mark, searching his face for some crack, some hint of exaggeration. But his eyes were steady, the eyes of a man who had seen too much to bother with lies. "So, which would you choose?" she asked quietly. He didn't hesitate. "Whichever keeps the boy alive." The rain had just started when they stepped out of the diner, a fine mist that turned the parking lot into a slick mirror of neon reflections. Laura pulled Daniel close, her heart still heavy with the weight of Mark's warning. She was about to ask what their next step should be when she noticed them, two men in dark coats, standing by the edge of the lot, their faces shadowed, their posture too deliberate. Mark noticed them too. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he shoved Laura and Daniel toward a battered pickup parked under the flickering light. "Get in. Now." The urgency in his tone sent ice through Laura's veins. She scrambled into the passenger seat, pulling Daniel onto her lap, just as Mark slammed the truck into gear. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt, spitting water as they surged forward. Behind them, headlights flared to life. A black sedan roared after them, engine snarling. The first bullet cracked the rear window, shards spraying into the cab. Laura screamed, clutching Daniel to her chest as he buried his face in her shoulder. "Oh my God!" The sound was deafening, shattering the fragile illusion that this was still just about money or secrets. Mark kept his focus on the road, knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Hold on!" he barked. He swerved onto the highway, the truck fishtailing before catching grip. The sedan stayed close, headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Another shot rang out, punching a hole into the tailgate. Laura's breath came in gasps, terror clawing through her ribs. She pressed Daniel's head down, shielding him with her body. Her mind reeled. How had it come to this? Paintings in crates, a text on her phone, and now bullets tearing through the night. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about survival, about silence. Mark cursed under his breath, eyes flicking between the road and the pursuing car. "They're professionals," he muttered. "Not goons. They'll keep coming." He jerked the wheel, swerving onto a smaller road, trees closing in on either side. The sedan followed, its beams slicing through the darkness. Laura dared a glance behind them, her stomach lurching at how close they were. "What do they want?" she cried, her voice breaking. Mark's answer was cold, final. "Not just the art. They want silence. Yours." Her blood froze. The words cut through the chaos louder than the gunfire. Not silence as in negotiation. Silence as in finality, as in death. The truck jolted violently as Mark swerved onto a dirt road, mud spraying against the windshield. The sedan tried to follow, its tires screeching, but the road narrowed, branches clawing at the sides. Mark gunned the engine, the truck leaping forward, bouncing hard enough to rattle Laura's teeth. The sedan's lights wavered, then finally disappeared behind a curve. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Mark slowed only when the road bent into deep woods, cutting the headlights to a dim glow. The only sound was the rasp of Laura's breathing and Daniel's muffled sobs. She turned to Mark, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" His eyes were grim, reflecting the faint glow of the dashboard. "We find out who's pulling the strings. We figure out what Charles started, and we don't stop moving until we know exactly how far this goes." Laura tightened her hold on Daniel, her heart still pounding. She had stepped into something vast and merciless, something that threatened to consume them whole. The art was no longer just canvases and crates, it was a weapon, and she and her son were trapped at the center of the battlefield it had ignited. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, the kind of place that should have been comforting in its simplicity. Mark had built it years ago as a retreat, a hideout where the outside world couldn't reach him. Now it felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a waiting room for truths Laura had been avoiding. She sat on the worn couch, Daniel beside her with his knees pulled to his chest, while Mark poured strong coffee into chipped mugs. His movements were steady, deliberate, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in everything he did, as though time itself was running thin. "You deserve the whole picture," Mark began, sliding into the armchair opposite them, his eyes fixed on Laura, sharp and unflinching. "Your ex-husband wasn't just dabbling in art, he was moving money through it. Lots of money." Laura frowned, clutching the mug, though she didn't drink. "You mean laundering?" Mark nodded. "Exactly. Art's the perfect vehicle for it, hard to trace, values fluctuate wildly, and all it takes is a gallery or a shell company to make dirty money look legitimate. Charles bought pieces through shady channels Eastern Europe, private auctions where questions aren't asked. He'd flip them to other buyers, sometimes real, sometimes invented, and the money came out clean." Her stomach turned. She had known Charles was reckless, that his charm often hid corners of dishonesty, but she had never imagined this. "And the warehouse?" she whispered. "That's where he made his mistake," Mark said grimly. "Somewhere along the line, he betrayed the people he was working with. Instead of moving pieces through the cycle, he held on to them. Stashed them in that unit. A collection too valuable, too hot to sell openly. Maybe he thought he could wait until the heat died down. Maybe he planned to use it as leverage someday. Either way, it was a betrayal. And in that world?" He shook his head. "Betrayal doesn't go unpunished." Laura felt a chill despite the fire crackling in the hearth. "That's why they're after me," she said slowly. "Because they think I know where it island. Because they think I might sell it." "Not think," Mark corrected. "They know you found it. And now they want to tie off the loose ends." Silence hung heavy. Daniel's small voice broke it, thin and tentative. "So, Dad's a criminal?" Laura's heart cracked. She looked at her son, at the confusion and hurt etched across his young face, and wished she could offer him a softer truth. But lies had already cost them too much. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "Yes," she whispered. "He island." Daniel's eyes shimmered, but he didn't cry. He just nodded, as if some part of him had suspected all along. Mark leaned forward, voice low. "This isn't about justice, Laura. It's about survival. You and your boy are targets now, not just because of what you found, but because of what you represent. To them, you're leverage. You're a threat. And until we figure out exactly who's pulling the strings, you can't trust anyone." Laura swallowed hard, the words anchoring themselves deep. The man she had once loved, the father of her child, had not only abandoned her emotionally, he had abandoned them to a storm she couldn't have prepared for. And now that storm was closing in. The cabin was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that only comes when snow drifts outside and the woods fall into silence. Laura allowed herself to believe, for just a moment, that they were safe. Mark had shown them the floorboards in the small bedroom, an old escape hatch built during his FBI days. "Just in case," he had said, though Laura had tried not to imagine why they might ever need it. She had tucked Daniel into bed, smoothing the blanket over him, and sat by the fire until her own eyes grew heavy. The sound came like a thunderclap against the quiet, glass shattering, a door slamming open, heavy boots pounding across the wooden floor. Laura jolted upright, her heart lurching into her throat. Mark was already on his feet, pulling a weapon from a hidden compartment in the wall, his voice sharp. "Go. Now." Laura grabbed Daniel, who was already awake, his eyes wide with terror. She pulled him toward the small bedroom, hands fumbling at the loose floorboards Mark had shown her. The wood came free with a groan, and she shoved Daniel into the darkness below before sliding in after him. The floor closed above them, just as footsteps thundered into the room. The space beneath was narrow, suffocating. Dust tickled Laura's throat, but she pressed a hand over Daniel's mouth, praying he wouldn't cough. They lay side by side in the darkness, listening as chaos unfolded above them. Shouts. A crash. The sharp metallic bark of gunfire. Laura's body trembled, every nerve screaming to move, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She clutched Daniel's hand, her fingernails biting into his skin as boots stomped inches above their heads. The sound of furniture splintering filled the cabin, drawers ripped open, belongings tossed aside. The attackers were systematic, professional. Not looters, not random. They knew what they were looking for. Daniel shifted slightly, his breath hot against her palm. She whispered into his ear, so soft it was almost breath alone. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Minutes stretched into eternity. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a knife against her skin. She pictured the men in dark coats from the diner parking lot. Imagined their cold eyes scanning the cabin. Imagined what they would do if they found them. Her heart pounded so violently, she was certain they could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, silence fell. Laura waited, terrified to believe it was over. The quiet pressed down like a weight, broken only by a faint, ragged breathing. Slowly, carefully, Mark lifted the floorboard above them, his face pale, streaked with sweat, a cut bleeding along his temple. His chest rose and fell heavily. "It's clear," he rasped. Laura climbed out, pulling Daniel with her. The cabin was unrecognizable. Chairs smashed, drawers yanked open, papers scattered like confetti. The front door hung from its hinges, glass glittering across the floor. The attackers were gone, but they had left nothing untouched. Mark leaned against the wall, wincing as he pressed a hand to his side. "They were trained," he said, his voice grim. "Not thieves, not amateurs. They knew exactly where to hit, what to look for." Laura's knees buckled, and she dropped onto the couch frame, the cushions strewn across the floor. Daniel climbed into her lap, burying his face against her shoulder. She held him tightly, rocking him instinctively, her own tears burning but refusing to fall. The message was clear. They weren't safe here. They weren't safe anywhere. The enemy knew exactly where to find them, and next time, Laura knew, they wouldn't be lucky enough to hide beneath the floorboards. The parking garage smelled of damp concrete and oil, the fluorescent lights above flickering just enough to make Laura's stomach coil tighter. Mark had insisted she come, swearing he'd made arrangements with someone he trusted, someone who could finally pull them out of the spiral they had been caught in since opening that crate. She clutched Daniel's hand as they walked, the sound of their footsteps echoing like an accusation in the cavernous space. A dark sedan idled near the far wall, its headlights extinguished. Mark motioned her forward, every line of his body tense, his eyes cutting across every shadow. A man stepped out. Plain suit, plain tie, plain face, so nondescript he seemed designed to be forgotten. He held a folder under one arm, his expression unreadable. He looked at Laura first, then at Mark. "You were right to call," he said, his voice low but firm. Laura's mouth was dry. "Your FBI?" The man nodded, flipping open the folder with practiced precision. Inside were photographs, reports, grainy surveillance images of Charles, her ex-husband, smiling with men in tailored suits, shaking hands in places that didn't look like boardrooms but like back rooms. "We've been watching him for years," the agent admitted. "Money laundering, art smuggling, connections to groups you don't want to know about. But we never had proof. Until now." He slid one of the photographs across the hood of the sedan. Laura stared at Charles's face, frozen mid-laugh, a stranger in a $1,000 suit, arms slung around someone she didn't recognize. For years she had believed she knew him, had built her life on that belief. But the evidence kept stacking, brick on brick, until the man she had married was buried under something monstrous. "We want the collection," the agent continued. "It's enough to bring down networks we've been chasing for a decade. We can put him away, and we can protect you and your boy." His eyes flicked toward Daniel, who leaned against Laura, silent, but listening. "Witness protection?" Mark asked. The agent nodded. "New names, new lives, you'll disappear. No one will ever find you." For a fleeting moment, Laura felt the smallest breath of relief. Safe, protected, finally free of the shadows. But the agent's tone shifted as he closed the folder, his gaze narrowing. "There's a catch." Laura stiffened. "What catch?" "If the art is proven stolen, it will be seized. Permanently. It will be repatriated, returned to governments or museums. You won't see a dime. You'll have safety, but not security. No inheritance, no future built on it, just a life in hiding, always looking over your shoulder." The words cut into her like glass. All the months of struggle after the divorce, every bill she had juggled, every moment she had patched over Daniel's worry with reassurances she barely believed gone, erased by a system that would never see her as anything but collateral. She had stumbled into unimaginable value, a collection people would kill for, and the choice now was to hand it over or risk everything. She looked at Daniel, his eyes searching hers with unspoken questions. Could she raise him in hiding, stripped of identity and history? Could she surrender everything to an agency that saw her only as a witness, not as a mother trying to carve a future from rubble? Her throat burned as she whispered, "What if I don't agree?" The agent's gaze didn't waver. "Then you stay on the run, alone. And people like Charles and the ones behind him will never stop hunting you. Safety or survival with dignity. That's the choice." Laura's heart pounded, the folder heavy in her hands, as if the paper itself carried the weight of every life-altering decision she had ever made. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand another option. But the garage was silent except for the hum of the idling car, the echo of her pulse, and the truth pressing her toward an answer she wasn't ready to give. The night air outside the garage was sharp, heavy with drizzle. Laura pulled her coat tighter, the folder clutched under her arm, her mind a storm. She had thought meeting the FBI would give her clarity, but all it had done was carve the path into two impossible roads. Daniel walked beside her, silent, sensing the turmoil she couldn't hide. Mark kept a step behind, his watchful gaze sweeping the shadows. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of shoes on wet pavement, slow, deliberate, familiar. Charles stepped out from behind a column, his coat collar turned up, his hair slick from the rain. He looked nothing like the man in the photographs the FBI agent had shown her. His arrogance was frayed now, his smile stretched too tight, his eyes burning with a desperation that unsettled her more than his threats ever had. "Laura," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "you shouldn't be here." Her body went rigid. "What do you want?" He smirked, though it faltered at the edges. "To warn you, don't trust them." He nodded toward the garage. "The Bureau doesn't care about you. They want the art for themselves. You'll hand it over and be left with nothing. They'll strip you of everything. Your name, your future, your life. And for what? To make their careers shine a little brighter?" Mark stepped forward, his stance defensive, but Charles ignored him. His focus was locked on Laura. "Help me instead," he pressed, his voice low and urgent. "We can sell the collection ourselves, quietly, split the profit. You and Daniel will never have to worry again. No hiding, no starting over. Real freedom." Laura stared at him, rain running down her face. For years she had believed his promises, believed that charm equaled truth. But the man standing before her wasn't charming anymore. He was cornered. His voice shook with panic, his movements sharp, restless. For the first time, she saw not the confident entrepreneur she had once loved, but the coward behind the mask. A man who had built his empire on lies and was now watching it collapse around him. "You betrayed them, didn't you?" she said quietly. "That's why you hid the paintings. That's why they want me dead. Because of you." Charles's jaw tightened. For a second he looked like he might deny it, but then his face twisted into something darker. "You don't understand the stakes," he hissed. "If I can't have that collection, no one will." The words lodged in Laura's chest like ice. She turned her back on him, pulling Daniel closer, her steps deliberate as she walked toward Mark's truck. Charles's voice echoed after her, sharp and bitter against the night. "Think about it, Laura. You'll regret this." But she didn't look back. For the first time in years, she saw him clearly, and she knew that whatever path she chose, it could never include him again. Laura's hands shook as she scrolled through the article on Mark's laptop, the words swimming before her eyes. The headline was crisp, elegant, meant to entice the wealthy and the reckless alike. "Private auction in Geneva. Masterpieces of the 20th century." The preview catalog was discreet, no photographs, only suggestive descriptions. Yet Laura recognized them instantly. Vivid dreamscape, blue and green, signed in corner. That was the Chagall. Abstract field of crimson, monumental scale. Rothko. The breath caught in her throat as she scanned the list, each line a dagger cutting deeper into the fragile hope she'd carried. These weren't coincidences. These were the paintings she had seen with her own eyes, hidden away in the crates Charles had left for her like a curse. Someone's leaking information. Mark muttered grimly, his jaw tight. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. The warehouse was off the books for years. Whoever's behind this had to know what was inside. His eyes flicked toward Laura, steady, but heavy with implication. "I think you know who." Laura closed her eyes. Charles's face flashing in her mind, the smirk in the parking lot, the desperation in his voice when he told her not to trust the FBI. Of course it was him. Who else would be reckless enough to play both sides? He had betrayed his partners once, and now he was trying to sell off the collection piece by piece, even if it meant dragging her into the fire with him. Her stomach turned, a sickness that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with betrayal. She wanted to scream, to cry, but all that came out was a whisper. "He'll destroy everything. He'll burn it all to the ground if it means I don't have it." Mark's gaze softened, but only slightly. "The Bureau's ready to move, if we can give them something solid. Testimony, confirmation that those pieces are tied to Charles. Without that, they'll treat it as rumor, and the sale goes ahead." The room seemed to shrink around her, walls pressing closer. She thought of Daniel asleep in the next room, his small body curled under a borrowed quilt, trusting her to keep him safe. She thought of the art, yes, its value, but also what it represented. History, legacy. Pieces ripped from their rightful homes, now dangled like bait for men who saw them only as currency. If she stayed silent, the collection vanished into private vaults. If she spoke, she risked everything, her safety, her son's safety, her life. "This isn't about money anymore," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's about proving the truth. Before Charles destroys it." Mark nodded slowly. "Then we fight." The warehouse loomed in the dark like a beast awakening, its rusted doors streaked with years of rain, its corrugated walls echoing secrets that had waited too long. Laura's heart hammered as she stepped into the gravel lot, every crunch under her shoes louder than it should have been. Mark had wanted to go in first, but she refused. If this was where it ended, she needed to face Charles herself, needed to look him in the eye and see what was left of the man who had once promised her forever. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and varnish, the faint musk of old wood. The crates towered in the shadows, silent sentinels of crimes too large for one person to bear. Laura stood among them, her breath shallow, waiting. And then he appeared. Charles stepped out from between the rows, his figure half lit by the faint beam of a hanging bulb. His face was gaunt now, stripped of the polish he'd worn like armor. His eyes burned, with something between desperation and madness. "Laura," he said, his voice cracking, "you shouldn't have come." Her chest tightened. "You shouldn't have dragged me into this." He laughed bitterly, the sound brittle as glass. "Dragged you in? You opened the crates. You made this a war." He stepped closer, his hands trembling. "You think you can hand it all over to the FBI and walk away clean? You think they care about you? They'll take it. They'll erase you. I'm the only one who can save us from this mess." She shook her head. "Save us? You put us here." His expression shifted, the mask slipping from anger to something rawer. "I did it for us," he pleaded. "For Daniel, for the life we were supposed to have. Do you know what I've had to do to keep it hidden? The lies I've told, the people I've betrayed? I kept it safe for us. For you." His voice broke, and for a moment he looked less like the man who had threatened her and more like someone cornered by his own ruin. But then the shadows moved, and Laura saw them. Men with guns, stepping out from behind the crates, faces hard, movements precise. Her blood ran cold. Charles's voice hardened again, dripping with menace. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Walk away. Let me finish this. Or you and the boy won't live to see tomorrow." Laura's body shook, but she lifted her chin. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "This ends tonight." Charles blinked, confusion flickering across his face, and then the roar of engines cut through the silence. Headlights blazed through the cracks in the walls as doors slammed, boots pounding in. FBI agents swarmed the warehouse, shouting commands, weapons raised. The armed men surrounding Laura froze, then scrambled as agents flooded in from every side. Charles's face twisted in fury as two agents grabbed him, wrenching his arms behind his back. He thrashed, his voice breaking into a scream that echoed through the cavernous space. "It's not hers!" he shouted, spittle flying. "It was never hers to begin with. The art is mine, do you hear me? Mine." Laura stood frozen, her breath coming in shuddering gasps, watching as the man she had once loved was dragged away, his voice growing fainter with every step. The crates towered around her, silent witnesses to the end of a story that had begun years ago in whispers and lies. Mark's hand touched her shoulder, steadying her. "It's over," he said softly. But Laura knew better. It wasn't over. Not yet. The art would be catalogued, claimed, fought over in courts and museums. The truth would have to be told again and again. And somewhere in the midst of it all, she would have to rebuild, not just for herself, but for Daniel. Still, as the agents filed past her, carrying the weight of decades in their hands, she allowed herself a single breath of relief. Charles was gone. The warehouse was no longer a prison. And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: she had survived. The warehouse was stripped bare under the FBI's watch, its secrets catalogued, its shadows turned into evidence. Agents moved methodically, their gloves careful as they lifted canvases that had been hidden for decades, sliding each into protective casings as though history itself might shatter if handled wrong. Laura stood with Daniel at her side, Mark a steady presence just behind them. She had never imagined she would see paintings worth more than her entire life in one place, let alone be the woman whose name was now tangled in their fate. The valuation reports arrived within days, each one a number that made her dizzy. $30 million. More than she could comprehend, more than anyone like her was ever meant to hold in their hands. But with those numbers came weight, the burden of history, of provenance, of stolen pasts clawing their way into the present. Some works would be sent back to families who had lost them to war. Others returned to national galleries. Still more would vanish into the slow gears of government, locked in storage until courts decided where they belonged. For a moment, Laura thought about saying yes when the Bureau offered their deal. Witness protection, new names, new lives, new schools for Daniel. The clean slate she had dreamed of in darker nights. But it wasn't clean at all. It was a cage painted white, a future spent hiding while Charles's sins continued to define her. She looked at her son, at the fear in his eyes when the agents explained what running would mean, and she knew she couldn't do it. "I'm not going into hiding," she said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "I've been invisible enough." Mark glanced at her, not with disapproval, but with the quiet respect of someone who knew the cost of that choice. Rachel arrived days later, her tote bag full of legal briefs, her face pale but determined. Together they carved a path Laura hadn't thought possible. She testified, again and again, in rooms filled with men who looked at her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be heard. She sat across from lawyers who tried to twist her words, who suggested she had known all along, who hinted that she might have been complicit. But each time, she spoke the truth. Not eloquently, not with the polish of someone trained for this battlefield, but with the raw honesty of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her voice. And little by little, it mattered. Courts listened. Claims were reviewed. Her testimony was entered into records thicker than phone books. She didn't win millions. She didn't walk away rich. But she secured legal restitution, a slice of funds set aside for those like her, the collateral damage of crimes too large for ordinary lives. Enough to stand again, enough to rebuild. The first time she walked out of a courtroom with Rachel at her side, Daniel clutching her hand, she realized she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back. And for the first time in years, that fight felt like life, not loss. 6 months later, sunlight spilled across the modest little house on the edge of town. The walls were pale yellow, the kind of color that seemed to glow even on cloudy days. The garden out front was nothing more than a square of earth, but Daniel had already planted tomato seedlings there, determined to grow something real, something theirs. Moving boxes sat half unpacked in the living room, books stacked beside the couch, dishes waiting to be shelved. It was imperfect, but it was theirs. Laura stood in the doorway of the small kitchen, watching Daniel race from room to room with the unself-conscious joy of a boy who no longer looked over his shoulder. The sound of his laughter filled the air, not weighed down by fear, not muffled by the walls of a safe house or the shadow of a warehouse. She leaned against the frame, letting herself breathe in the ordinary rhythm of their new life. On the wall above the couch hung a simple sketch, framed in a narrow black border. It wasn't valuable, Rachel had made that clear when she gave it to her. Just a pencil drawing, delicate and understated. But to Laura, it was priceless. Rachel had found it tucked in a forgotten file, an unfinished study by an artist who had once painted canvases now worth millions. She had given it to Laura not as wealth but as reminder that even in fragments, truth had value. Sometimes, late at night, Laura still woke to the echo of boots pounding above floorboards, the crash of glass, the memory of Charles's voice promising ruin. She knew healing wasn't a straight line. She knew shadows lingered. But when she looked around her home, the sunlight, the laughter, the framed sketch, she knew she had chosen right. She had chosen peace, not revenge, truth, not silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted their living room in amber, Daniel crawled onto the couch beside her. He rested his head against her shoulder, his voice quiet but heavy with the kind of question only children ask when the world has shown them too much. "Mom," he whispered, "are we safe now?" Laura wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close, her chin resting lightly on his hair. She thought about everything they had endured, the betrayal, the running, the fear that had chased them through every mile of road. She thought about the paintings, the headlines, the courtroom battles. And she thought about the truth, how it had nearly broken them, but had ultimately set them free. "Yes," she whispered into the quiet, her voice steady, "because we faced the truth, and the truth always wins." Daniel sighed softly, the weight in his body finally loosening as he drifted toward sleep. Laura held him, her gaze fixed on the framed sketch across the room, its lines simple yet unshakable, like them. Outside, the night crept in, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel threatening. It felt like promise. A new beginning, fragile but theirs. If you found yourself holding your breath through Laura's journey, don't forget to hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. The truth always wins, and tomorrow's tale will leave you speechless.